My name is Melanie, and at 30 years old, I never expected to be treated like garbage by the man who vowed to protect me. I am a forensic auditor. I run an independent financial analytics firm. My entire career revolves around finding the truth buried beneath layers of deception, yet I completely miss the massive fraud sitting in the driver's seat next to me. Every pothole on the interstate sent a blinding spike of agony through my lower back. I was encased in a rigid lumbar brace, discharged from the hospital hours ago after high-risk spinal fusion surgery. My hands gripped the leather door handle of our luxury SUV until my knuckles turned pale. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to breathe through the searing pain. Beside me, my husband Jared sighed in annoyance. At 32, he was a sales director for a tech company, wearing tailored suits like armor and caring only about his public image. He took another sharp turn, tires squealing, completely disregarding my fragile physical state. I begged him to slow down, warning that the jarring motions were tearing my incision. Jared tightened his grip on the steering wheel, jaw clenching. He did not slow down. Instead, he stared straight ahead and delivered a statement that made the physical agony pale in comparison to the mental shock. "This Saturday, all 25 members of my family are arriving," he said, his tone utterly casual, as if discussing the weather. "They are staying at our house for 2 weeks." I stared at his profile, certain the heavy painkillers were causing me to hallucinate. I reminded him that I had just undergone major spinal surgery and could barely walk, let alone host a massive family reunion. I told him he needed to call them right now and postpone the trip or book them a block of hotel rooms downtown. Jared let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "No one is waiting," he said coldly. "And I am absolutely not paying for hotels when we have a 10,000 square foot estate. Just do as I say." I shifted in my seat, a sharp gasp escaping my lips as the brace dug into my healing spine. I tried to reason with him. I explained that I was strictly ordered to remain on bed rest, that having 24 people swarming the house was a recipe for absolute disaster. I pleaded with him to be rational. His expression hardened into a mask of pure contempt. "You are always so dramatic, Melanie. You act like you are the first person to have a medical procedure. My mother and my sister are coming, and they expect to be hosted properly. Brittany needs our house as her official headquarters for her major upcoming event, and she requires the space to be absolutely flawless." Brittany was his younger sister, the ultimate golden child. She paraded around the internet, calling herself a lifestyle influencer, constantly demanding luxury and expecting everyone else to foot the bill. And his mother, Catherine, was a domineering tyrant who treated me like the hired help rather than a daughter-in-law. I pushed back, my voice trembling with a mixture of pain and rising fury. I reminded Jared that I run a demanding financial firm, that I am the sole owner of the property, and that I am physically incapacitated. I told him I am not a maid, and I will not be serving his entitled mother and sister while recovering from surgical trauma. Jared sneered, glancing at me with utter disgust. "Oh, please. Your little independent analytics company is just boring desk work. You stare at spreadsheets all day. It is not like you have a real high-pressure career like mine. You can manage to organize a few guest rooms. Your primary duty right now is making sure my family is comfortable. My mother and Brittany have very specific expectations, and I will not have you embarrassing me by playing the lazy, bedridden victim." The sheer audacity of his words left me breathless. This was the man who held my hand in the pre-op room, pretending to be the doting, worried husband for the nurses. Now isolated in the confines of his car, his true narcissistic nature was on full display. He did not view me as a partner. He viewed me as an asset, a prop to maintain his pristine social facade. We pulled into the long, winding driveway of the New England estate. The property was a sprawling, modern masterpiece that I purchased through my own LLC long before I ever met Jared. Yet he constantly paraded around as the lord of the manor, using his tech salary to pay for utilities and minor upkeep, which somehow cemented his delusion of ownership. He threw the SUV into park near the front steps. Instead of unbuckling his seatbelt to help me navigate the painful process of getting out of the car, he reached into his designer briefcase. He pulled out a thick packet of papers and tossed it directly onto my lap. I looked down at the multi-page document. It was a highly detailed, itemized grocery and chore list. It outlined specific meal plans, premium alcohol requests, thread count requirements for the guest bed linens, and a cleaning schedule for the bathrooms. "Pop some pills and get the guest rooms perfect," Jared ordered, not even bothering to look at me. "Catherine wants the master suite ready for her, so move your medical stuff out of sight. I have a crucial client dinner tonight. Do not call me unless the house is burning down." Without another word, he unlocked the doors and threw the car into reverse, speeding off into the fading evening light. He left me completely stranded on the cold pavement, physically broken and entirely alone. The pain was excruciating, but the emotional cord connecting me to my husband had just been violently severed. He thought he could break me. Watch me. The cold pavement radiated through the soles of my shoes as I stood alone in the driveway. The taillights of Jared's SUV had already disappeared around the bend, leaving me with nothing but the biting night air and the ridiculous multi-page chore list crumpled in my fist. Every breath I took felt like a rusted blade twisting into my lower back. The spinal fusion was only days behind me. My rigid lumbar brace felt less like a medical support and more like an iron cage. Taking a single step forward required a monumental negotiation between my brain and my damaged nerves. I focused on the front door of the estate. It was barely 50 feet away, but it might as well have been a marathon. I dragged my right foot forward, swallowing a sharp cry as lightning shot down my leg. I slowly dragged the left foot to meet it. Step by step, inch by agonizing inch, I made my way up the stone stairs. By the time I finally pushed the heavy oak door open and stumbled into the foyer, my forehead was slick with cold sweat and my vision swam with dark fuzzy spots. I had barely managed to kick the door shut when my phone began vibrating relentlessly in my pocket. A rapid succession of harsh buzzing echoed in the silent, cavernous entryway. With trembling fingers, I pulled it out. The notifications were pouring in from the family group chat. I leaned against the cool plaster wall and read the demands scrolling across the screen. Catherine had sent a bulleted list. She dictated that she and Brittany would be taking the primary master suite because the lighting in that room was best for Brittany's makeup tutorials. A subsequent message from Brittany followed complaining about the aesthetic of my medical equipment. She explicitly instructed me to move my adjustable bed and recovery gear down to the unfinished basement. She typed that having a sick person lounging in the main living areas would be an absolute eyesore for her guests and would completely ruin the vibe of her upcoming events. They actually expected a woman recovering from major spinal surgery to navigate a steep flight of concrete basement stairs just to stay out of their sight. I stared at the glowing screen, my thumb hovering over the keypad. A dozen furious responses crossed my mind, but I did not type a single letter. I simply locked the screen and let the phone drop back into my pocket. I refused to engage with their delusion. They wanted a submissive, desperate wife scrambling to accommodate their toxic hierarchy. I was not going to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, I focused on survival. I shuffled past the grand staircase, ignoring the plush living room, and made a slow, torturous trek toward my home office at the back of the house. The pain was escalating from a sharp stab to a blinding, relentless throb. I reached my desk, practically collapsing into my ergonomic chair. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely open the top drawer, but I managed to retrieve my prescribed heavy-duty painkillers. I swallowed the medication dry, leaning my head back against the leather chair and waiting for the chemical fog to dull the agony. Once the sharpest edge of the pain began to recede, my analytical instincts kicked in. I reached for my encrypted work laptop. As a forensic auditor handling highly sensitive financial data, my security protocols were ironclad. But right now, the greatest threat was not corporate espionage. It was the entitled, invasive family members arriving in less than 48 hours. I placed the laptop inside my heavy steel biometric safe, pressed my thumb to the scanner, and listened to the heavy bolts lock into place. My business was secure. I managed to drag myself to the downstairs guest bedroom, gingerly lowering my battered body onto the mattress. Exhaustion pulled me under quickly. Hours later, the sharp, jarring chime of the front gate intercom ripped me out of a deep sleep. I jerked awake, a fresh wave of pain, reminding me of my broken state. The digital clock on the nightstand read past 11. Panic flared in my chest. If Catherine and Brittany had decided to arrive early to inspect the premises, I was in no physical condition to fight them off. I grabbed my phone and accessed the exterior security cameras. I held my breath as the high-definition feed loaded. Standing on the front porch, illuminated by the harsh yellow glow of the security light, was not my mother-in-law. It was a tall, broad-shouldered African-American man holding a large paper bag. It was Andre. Andre was a seasoned residential contractor married to Jared's older sister Monica. He and Monica were the absolute black sheep of Jared's family entirely by their own design. They were grounded, hard-working, and fiercely independent, which meant they utterly refused to bow to Catherine's manipulative games or cater to Brittany's endless vanity. Consequently, they were treated as outcasts invited to family dinners only to be talked down to. I respected them immensely. I pressed the intercom button to unlock the door, calling out for him to come inside. A moment later, I heard his heavy work boots stepping into the foyer. He found me in the guest room attempting to sit up. Andre immediately set the paper bag on a nearby table and rushed over, gently placing a hand on my shoulder to stop me from moving. "Do not get up, Melanie," he said, his deep voice thick with concern. "Monica sent me. We figured that idiot brother of hers left you completely stranded without a decent meal. I brought some hot food." I thanked him, the genuine kindness nearly bringing tears to my eyes after the sheer cruelty of the afternoon. But as Andre pulled up a chair beside the bed, I noticed how rigid his posture was. The warm, easygoing contractor I knew looked intensely worried, his jaw clenched tight. I asked him what was wrong. Andre let out a heavy sigh, running a hand over his face. He told me he and Monica had attended a family dinner at Catherine's house tonight, the same dinner Jared had rushed off to. Andre confessed he had to leave the table early because he could not stomach the conversation happening over dessert. He reached into the pocket of his heavy canvas jacket and pulled out his smartphone. He looked me dead in the eye, his expression grave. "I went to the kitchen to get a drink," he said quietly. "But I accidentally left my phone sitting on the dining room table with the voice memo app running. You need to hear this right now." Andre tapped the screen and pressed play. The tinny audio from Andre's phone filled the quiet guest bedroom, cutting through the heavy silence like a surgical scalpel. At first, there was only the clinking of silverware and the muffled sound of pouring expensive wine. Then Brittany's shrill, excited voice pierced the static. She complained about the floral arrangements, insisting the grand foyer of my house needed a massive orchid display to serve as the backdrop for her lifestyle brand launch. I listened, my heart slowing, as the true nature of this upcoming invasion came to light. This was not a simple family reunion. It was Brittany's extravagant, over-the-top wedding masquerading as a corporate launch party. Catherine's voice chimed in next, dripping with her usual suffocating entitlement. She assured her daughter the aesthetic would be absolutely flawless, emphasizing the estate was the only venue suitable for such a high-caliber matrimonial event. She then directed her full attention to my husband, asking if the property transfer logistics were finalized. Jared answered his tone, carrying that arrogant, unearned swagger I once mistaken for confidence. He proudly told his mother and sister not to worry about anything at all. He bragged he had secured the ultimate wedding gift for his favorite sister. He was giving her the house. He actually said those exact words. He intended to hand over the multi-million-dollar property, the very estate I purchased with my holding company, to Brittany as a permanent wedding present. The sheer absurdity of his statement kept me completely frozen, but the conversation quickly shifted from delusional to highly predatory. Brittany whined, asking how he was going to get me to agree to hand over the deed, complaining I was always too stubborn. Catherine interjected, her voice suddenly lowering into a venomous, quiet hiss. She instructed Jared not to ask permission, but to orchestrate a legal ambush. She laid out the exact strategy, noting my spinal surgery provided the perfect window of opportunity. She told Jared to wait until Friday evening when the surgical pain peaked and I was heavily dosed on prescribed narcotics. Jared chuckled a dark sound that made the blood in my veins run ice cold. It was a dismissive, cruel laugh he usually reserved for incompetent waiters, now directed entirely at his crippled wife. He enthusiastically agreed with his mother's timeline, confirming by Friday night I would be entirely docile and drugged out of my mind. He mocked my physical weakness, calling me a truly pathetic sight, assuring them I would be in too much of a chemical fog to read the fine print. He proudly detailed his plan to present the paperwork as a routine insurance liability form required for guests. Hidden beneath that fabricated cover page would be a binding quitclaim deed, legally transferring the title of the estate entirely out of my name and into Brittany's corporate entity. The audio continued, accurately capturing their vile, premature celebration. Jared joked about exactly how easy it would be to manipulate a bedridden woman. Catherine praised his ruthless, calculating business sense. Brittany squealed with delight, already planning which specific walls she would knock down in my master suite to expand her closet. Every single syllable spoken on that recording systematically dismantled the last 5 years of my life. The illusion of my marriage pulverized into dust. The man who promised to protect me was actively weaponizing my trauma to render me defenseless. He was not a negligent partner making a foolish concession. He was an opportunistic predator plotting to strip me of my greatest asset while my spine was literally stitched back together. Andre reached forward and quickly tapped the screen, cutting off the audio. The sudden absolute silence in the room was deafening. He sat back heavily, running a hand over his short-cropped hair, his dark eyes filled with intense disgust and profound sorrow. He looked at me, visibly bracing himself for the emotional collapse most people would experience after hearing their spouse plot their financial ruin. He solemnly warned me Jared had already booked a shady, under-the-table notary for Friday evening, someone absolutely willing to validate signatures without asking necessary legal questions about a signee's mental capacity or chemical impairment. Andre told me he and Monica suspected Jared was financially reckless, but never imagined he was capable of this level of orchestrated malice. He offered to stay to call the police or to help me pack a bag and get to a safe hotel immediately. I looked down at my pale hands resting on the blanket. They were perfectly, remarkably still. The heavy-duty painkillers had successfully dulled the fiery stabbing in my lumbar region, but a very different kind of anesthesia had taken over my mind. I did not shed a single solitary tear. I did not scream panic or hyperventilate. Instead, a chilling, deeply calculated calmness washed over me. It was the exact same clinical detachment I felt when cracking open a fraudulent corporate ledger, that precise moment when the chaotic numbers aligned to reveal the hidden theft. Jared fundamentally misunderstood the woman he married. He assumed my physical immobility equated to mental surrender. He believed my temporary vulnerability made me an easy mark for his extortion. He forgot that long before I became his wife, I was a seasoned forensic auditor trained to destroy financial criminals. I looked up at Andre, my expression completely void of fear. I sincerely thanked him for bringing me the truth tonight. I told him to safely go home to Monica, to keep her entirely out of the incoming blast radius, and to pretend he never heard that conversation. Andre hesitated, searching my face for any sign of a breakdown, but found only the cold, hard focus of a predator recognizing its prey. He slowly nodded, zipped up his heavy canvas jacket, and quietly let himself out the front door, leaving me alone in the dark. As the heavy lock clicked shut, I slowly reached for my phone, ready to begin. The device felt heavy in my palm, but I set it aside on the polished wood of the nightstand. Phone calls could wait. Right now, I needed raw, unfiltered data. I pushed myself up from the edge of the guest bed, biting the inside of my cheek until I tasted sharp copper. The restrictive lumbar brace held my spine in a rigid, unforgiving grip. My surgeon had sternly warned me about pushing my physical limits so soon after the operation, but the pure adrenaline coursing through my veins was a far more potent anesthetic than any of the prescribed narcotics sitting in my drawer. The vulnerable, recovering wife Jared thought he had left behind vanished into the shadows of the empty hallway. In her place, the ruthless forensic auditor took total control. I made my way back to my home office, dragging my feet across the cold hardwood floor. The house was entirely silent, a stark contrast to the absolute chaos my husband was currently orchestrating behind my back. I reached the biometric safe, bolted securely beneath my massive desk. I pressed my thumb against the glowing scanner. A soft beep echoed in the room and the heavy steel door sprang open. I pulled out my encrypted work laptop, the powerful machine that held the keys to my actual empire. I placed it on the desk and eased myself into my ergonomic chair, meticulously adjusting the backrest to support my newly fused vertebrae. The screen flickered to life, casting a pale, cold glow across my determined face. It was time to systematically dismantle Jared's delusion. I opened my secure cloud drive and pulled up the official property deeds for the estate. Jared loved to parade around this 10,000 square foot mansion, boasting to his friends and colleagues about the prime real estate he had supposedly acquired. He truly believed that paying the monthly electric bills and covering the seasonal landscaping costs somehow granted him legitimate equity. He was profoundly mistaken. I stared at the digitized legal documents, confirming what I already knew. The property did not belong to Jared. It did not even belong to me directly. It belonged entirely to a limited liability company I had formed, funded, and registered in Delaware 3 years before Jared and I even crossed paths. I owned 100% of that corporate entity. Jared's name was completely absent from the deed, the mortgage, and the holding company's operating agreement. He had absolutely zero legal standing. He was, by all legal definitions, merely a tenant living under my roof. His grand scheme to force me to sign a quitclaim deed was not just morally bankrupt, it was financially illiterate. But Jared's sheer audacity to attempt such a bold heist meant he was desperate. And in my specialized line of work, desperation always leaves a glaring paper trail. I switched tabs, booting up my proprietary financial tracking software. I linked our joint checking accounts first, then bypassed his weak security questions to access his personal banking portals. I had noticed his spending habits escalating over the past year, but the raw numbers populating on my screen were staggering. I scrolled through months of detailed bank statements, my eyes scanning the endless rows of red deficit markers. There was a massive erratic cash bleed. He was hemorrhaging money at a genuinely alarming rate. He was dropping $10,000 a week on luxury car rentals, catering deposits, and high-end event planners. He had wired $50,000 just 2 days ago to a premier floral designer based out of state. The basic math simply did not add up. Jared made a handsome salary as a sales director at his technology firm, but he did not make this kind of exorbitant money. He was spending like a multi-millionaire, burning through liquid cash that far exceeded his annual income and his maximum available credit lines. I leaned closer to the screen, deliberately ignoring the sharp, throbbing pain shooting up my damaged spine. My fingers flew across the keyboard. If the money was not coming from his salary, and it was not coming from our joint savings, it had to be coming from an illicit external source. I needed to find the exact origin of this sudden, inexplicable wealth. I accessed a highly restricted backdoor portal I rarely used for personal matters. My independent analytics firm held the primary auditing contract for the massive parent corporation that owned Jared's tech company. It was a massive conflict of interest for him to know the extent of my access, so I had always kept that specific professional boundary strictly separate from our marriage. Tonight, that professional boundary completely evaporated. I tapped into the parent company's raw corporate ledger data and ran a targeted algorithmic search for Jared's department. The software chewed through thousands of transactions in mere seconds. When the final results populated, my breath caught in my throat. I uncovered a highly sophisticated yet ultimately traceable web of unauthorized wire transfers. Jared was not just overspending on a lavish party, he was actively embezzling corporate funds. He was generating fake vendor invoices from non-existent tech suppliers, approving them with his director-level clearance, and routing the payments entirely out of the company. I tracked the stolen money as it bounced through a complex series of shell companies. I followed the digital breadcrumbs, watching the stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars flow seamlessly across international borders. The illicit funds were being funneled directly into offshore accounts stationed in the Cayman Islands. I ran a cross-reference check on the registration of those specific offshore accounts. The screen refreshed, displaying the final beneficiary. The offshore accounts were legally registered to a newly formed corporate entity dedicated entirely to launching a luxury lifestyle brand. The sole proprietor of that brand was Brittany. Jared was not just a terrible husband, he was a federal criminal. I stared at the glowing screen, the harsh blue light reflecting off my irises. The sheer scale of his arrogance was almost mesmerizing. He had weaponized his director-level clearance to authorize illicit payments to shell companies that existed only on paper. I dug deeper into the raw data, effortlessly bypassing standard security protocols by utilizing the highest-level administrative credentials my firm possessed for the parent corporation. As a forensic auditor, I was trained to spot irregularities that sophisticated algorithms missed. The numbers populating my monitor painted a grotesque, undeniable portrait of a man desperately trying to buy his family's conditional love with stolen money. It was textbook embezzlement executed with the reckless confidence of someone who truly believed he was untouchable. The offshore accounts linked to Brittany's corporate entity were the central hub of his financial crimes. From there, the stolen cash splintered into dozens of different directions, creating a chaotic web of luxury spending. I tracked a specific wire transfer initiated exactly 3 months ago for $85,000. The routing number perfectly matched a high-end European auto dealership located 2 states away. Jared had bought Brittany a luxury sports car, completely paid off in a single transaction. Another series of recurring payments disguised as corporate software licensing fees were actually funding Catherine's exorbitant monthly dues at the most exclusive country club in New England. He was literally stealing from his employer to ensure his mother could sip champagne with local socialites and brag endlessly about her successful son. Every transaction felt like a fresh betrayal, a testament to how little I meant to him compared to their approval. But the most aggressive cash hemorrhaging had occurred within the last 4 weeks. I found a concentrated cluster of massive transactions falsely labeled as international marketing expenditures. I carefully cross-referenced the vendor identification numbers and uncovered the sickening truth. They were 6-figure deposits for Brittany's upcoming wedding and lifestyle brand launch. Jared had paid for an elite celebrity event planner, secured a Michelin-starred catering team, and commissioned a custom couture gown for his sister, all using embezzled corporate funds. He was bankrolling a delusion of grandeur, and the final bill was rapidly approaching $1 million. He was financing their extravagant lifestyle by robbing a multinational corporation blind. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, a sudden sharp ache flaring in my fused spine. But the physical discomfort was entirely eclipsed by a massive intellectual breakthrough. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together in my mind. Jared's sudden, desperate urgency to transfer the deed of my 10,000-square-foot estate into Brittany's name was not an act of unparalleled sibling generosity. It was a calculated, frantic cover-up. I checked the parent corporation's financial calendar on a separate monitor. The mandatory comprehensive quarterly audit was scheduled to begin in exactly 14 days. My firm would be conducting that audit. Jared was completely out of stolen cash. The corporate accounts he had been bleeding dry were hitting automated internal review thresholds. If my team of auditors arrived and found the gaping bleeding holes in his department's budget, he would be immediately terminated, investigated, and prosecuted. He needed a massive, immediate injection of liquid capital to quietly replace the missing corporate funds before the fast-approaching deadline. My estate was worth millions. If he could successfully ambush me into signing that quitclaim deed on Friday night, he could instantly use the property as collateral to secure a high-risk rapid approval equity loan. He fully planned to use my home to pay back the money he stole for his sister's wedding, leaving me homeless and him looking like a savior. A cold, dangerous smile curved my lips. I opened a new heavily encrypted folder on my secure laptop. I began meticulously dragging and dropping every single piece of damning evidence into the digital vault. I saved the fraudulent vendor invoices Jared had personally signed. I archived the digital footprints tracking the wire transfers across international borders. I captured high-resolution screenshots of the offshore account registrations bearing Brittany's name. Every keystroke was another nail in their collective coffin. I compiled a bulletproof, irrefutable dossier of white-collar crime that any federal prosecutor would consider an absolute slam dunk. The evidence was pristine, chronological, and entirely damning. I locked the dossier behind a 24-character alphanumeric password and dual biometric authentication. Staring at the glowing screen in the quiet darkness of my home office, the ultimate reality of my situation washed over me. I was no longer a victim trapped in a failing marriage. I was the executioner. I held the absolute power to send my husband to federal prison and financially bankrupt his toxic, entitled family in a single devastating stroke. I reached for a fresh legal pad and a pen, completely ignoring the throbbing pain radiating up my back. I clicked the pen and began drafting a meticulous hour-by-hour timeline for their absolute destruction. The first entry on the legal pad was my immediate escape plan. The second entry outlined the complete liquidation of every piece of physical comfort Jared believed he owned. I needed to move fast. The window between his current arrogance and the inevitable collapse of his financial house of cards was incredibly narrow. He thought Friday night would be his ultimate victory, the moment he finally stripped me of my most valuable asset to save his own miserable skin. He was counting on my physical pain to make me weak and compliant. I wrote down the contact information for my divorce attorney, pressing the pen so hard into the paper that it nearly tore through the thick yellow sheet. I was going to give Jared exactly what he wanted. I was going to give him the surprise of a lifetime, orchestrated with the clinical precision of a woman who had absolutely nothing left to lose. Wednesday morning broke with a deceptive stillness. The sun crept through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the guest bedroom, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I had barely slept, my mind vibrating with the sheer magnitude of the financial destruction I had just orchestrated on my encrypted hard drive. My spine throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, a stark reminder of my physical limitations. But physical limitations were irrelevant when you had capital leverage and absolute clarity. I was no longer the wounded wife waiting for her husband to show an ounce of compassion. I was a general preparing for war, and it was time to assemble my strike team. Jared was already gone. He had left before sunrise, casually texting that he was working late to close a massive quarter-end deal. I knew exactly what that meant. He was meeting with caterers, cutting illicit checks, and desperately trying to keep his stolen house of cards from collapsing before his family arrived. His absence provided the exact window of opportunity I needed. I adjusted my medical bed to a slight incline, gritting my teeth against the sharp bite of pain in my lower back, and reached for my phone. My first call was to Veronica, a notoriously ruthless family law attorney renowned throughout New England for dismantling wealthy, arrogant men. She answered on the second ring, her tone crisp and professional. I did not waste time exchanging pleasantries. I laid out the situation with brutal efficiency. I detailed the impending arrival of the 25 unwelcomed guests, the audio recording of the quitclaim conspiracy, and the offshore embezzlement. I instructed her to draft immediate, unforgiving separation papers. There would be no mediation, no cooling-off period, and absolutely no room for negotiation. I wanted an ironclad legal barrier erected between Jared and my assets before the weekend began. Veronica did not express sympathy. She expressed predatory excitement. She promised the documents would be ready for my signature by Thursday evening. The legal foundation was secured, but paperwork would not stop a horde of entitled relatives from breaching my front gates. I needed a physical barricade. My second call was to Vanguard Solutions, a highly exclusive ex-military private security firm that my auditing agency occasionally contracted for high-risk corporate assignments. I spoke directly with their operations director, a man named Dominic, who spoke in sharp-clipped sentences. I explained that I required a 5-man tactical detail for the upcoming weekend. I outlined the perimeter parameters, specifying that no one without my explicit verbal authorization was permitted onto the grounds, regardless of whether they claimed to be my husband, my mother-in-law, or my sister-in-law. Dominic quoted a staggering daily rate for an emergency, heavily armed residential detail. I did not even blink. I wired the retaining fee instantly, demanding they arrive in unmarked black vehicles to maintain the element of surprise. Dominic confirmed his team would secure the perimeter by Friday morning. The legal and physical defenses were now in motion, but the centerpiece of my strategy required something far more ambitious. Jared and his toxic family were expecting to walk into a 10,000 square foot luxury estate, fully furnished, impeccably decorated, and ready to serve as the picturesque backdrop for Britney's delusional lifestyle brand launch. I intended to give them an absolute void. My third and final call was to Apex Relocation, a premium rapid response moving and storage company catering to high net worth clients. I was connected to the regional manager, a man named Warren. I laid out my requirements. I needed every single piece of furniture, designer art, high-end appliance, and luxury decor removed from my estate. The house needed to be stripped down to the bare hardwood floors and drywall. Warren hesitated, his voice thick with skepticism. He politely explained that clearing a 10,000 square foot property typically required weeks of logistical planning, specialized packing teams, and a massive fleet of vehicles. He stated that attempting a full extraction within a 24-hour deadline was virtually impossible. I listened to his excuses without interrupting. When he finished, I calmly asked for his direct banking details. I offered to pay a 300% premium on top of his highest emergency rate to completely bypass his current queue. I told him he could pull every available crew member off their scheduled jobs and pay them double overtime, and I would cover it all without a second thought. Money was simply a tool, and right now I was using it to buy utter devastation. There was a heavy pause on the line. I could practically hear Warren doing the math in his head. The skepticism vanished, replaced by the eager compliance of a man who had just been handed a blank check. He asked for the gate code and assured me that a convoy of his largest trucks would be idling at the edge of my property by dawn on Thursday. He guaranteed that by sunset my mansion would be an empty, echoing cavern. I ended the call and let my phone drop onto the mattress. A deep, profoundly satisfying exhaustion washed over my battered body. Every piece was perfectly positioned on the chessboard. The divorce was in motion. The security perimeter was established. The great erasure of my home was locked in. I closed my work laptop, the heavy biometric safe, sealing away the financial guillotine that would end Jared's career and his freedom. The trap was flawlessly set. Just as the screen went black, the distinct crunch of gravel echoed from the front driveway. I glanced at the security monitor mounted on the wall. Jared's luxury SUV rolled up to the front steps. He stepped out, adjusting his tailored suit, looking incredibly smug and completely oblivious to the fact that he was walking into a war zone. I leaned back into the pillows, a cold smile touching my lips. Let the games begin. Thursday morning dawned with a sickly pale light filtering through the sheer curtains of the guest bedroom. Jared was already awake, tossing designer dress shirts and silk ties into his leather overnight bag. He moved with a frantic, jittery energy, attempting to mask his palpable panic under a thick layer of fabricated corporate importance. He buttoned his expensive suit jacket and glanced at me over his shoulder, delivering his latest lie with practiced, effortless ease. He claimed an emergency overnight business trip had suddenly materialized, a massive quarter-end deal that required his personal touch to close. He said he would not be back until late Friday afternoon. I watched him zip his bag, my expression entirely blank. I knew exactly where he was really going. He was not heading to a corporate boardroom. He was driving 2 states over to physically hand a stolen cashier's check to Britney's wedding caterers, desperately trying to keep his fraudulent house of cards standing for just one more day. Before walking out the door, he turned back to point a stern, authoritative finger at me. He demanded I push through my excruciating back pain and ensure the entire estate was absolutely spotless. He ordered me to fluff the pillows, polish the marble countertops, and make sure his mother's favorite scented candles were burning in the master suite. The front door slammed shut, cutting off his pathetic, demanding monologue. I waited exactly 5 minutes. I listened to the aggressive roar of his engine fade completely into the distance. As soon as absolute silence settled over the property, a new, much heavier rumble began to vibrate through the floorboards. I dragged myself out of the guest bed and strapped on my rigid lumbar brace. Moving with agonizing slowness, I navigated to the front window. A massive convoy of 6 pristine white moving trucks was rolling up the long, winding driveway. They parked in perfect, synchronized formation, completely dominating the circular motor court. The regional manager I had spoken to the day before stepped out of the lead vehicle. He held a thick clipboard and wore an expression of intense, hurried focus. I unlocked the front door and pressed a button on a small remote, lowering myself into an advanced motorized medical recovery chair I had ordered overnight. The chair supported my healing spine perfectly, while allowing me to move around the ground floor with zero physical exertion. I rolled out onto the front porch to greet the manager. He took one look at the sheer scale of the 10,000 square foot mansion and then looked down at me. I handed him a detailed floor plan I had printed from my secure laptop, highlighting every single room. I told him he had until sunset to make my entire home disappear. The operation was a staggering masterpiece of organized chaos. Dozens of burly men in matching uniforms swarmed into the grand foyer, moving with strict military precision. I sat in my mechanized chair, acting as the undisputed commander of the rapid extraction. I directed them room by room, watching as they systematically dismantled the visual illusion of Jared's wealth. They rolled up the massive, hand-woven Persian rugs that I had personally imported from Turkey. They unmounted the heavy, 85-inch flat-screen televisions from the living room walls. They carefully crated the original abstract paintings I had purchased during a highly exclusive art auction in New York. A team of 4 strong men hoisted the custom-made 12-seat solid mahogany dining table onto their shoulders and carried it out the grand front doors. Another crew entirely stripped the gourmet kitchen of its high-end espresso machine's designer stand mixers and every piece of expensive copper cookware. I watched them dismantle the velvet sectional sofas and wrap the crystal table lamps in thick layers of protective bubble wrap. Every single item they loaded into those cavernous trucks was a direct testament to my hard-earned financial success. I had paid for the imported Italian leather armchairs. I had funded the custom-built library shelves. Jared had contributed absolutely nothing to the physical comfort of this sprawling estate, yet he genuinely believed he was entitled to simply hand it all away to his spoiled sister. As the frantic hours ticked by, the vibrant, opulent mansion underwent a staggering, severe transformation. The warm, lived-in atmosphere completely evaporated rapidly, replaced by a cold, highly sterile void. Without the heavy rugs, plush drapes, and thick furniture to absorb the ambient sound, the acoustic nature of the house entirely altered. Every heavy footstep the movers took echoed sharply against the bare drywall and the exposed, gleaming hardwood floors. The house was being ruthlessly stripped down to its very bones. The sheer, overwhelming emptiness of the rooms actively amplified the gravity of my retaliatory plan. By late afternoon, the echoing silence was practically deafening. The moving manager approached my chair, wiping sweat from his brow, and handed me a final multi-page manifest to sign. He confirmed that the massive property was completely cleared. Not a single silver teaspoon decorative throw pillow or embroidered bath towel remained. I signed the document officially authorizing the convoy to transport my entire material life to a highly secure climate-controlled storage facility located 50 miles away. I sat in my medical chair and watched the fleet of white trucks roll back down the driveway, slowly disappearing into the fiery orange glow of the setting sun. The 10,000 square foot estate was now a barren, hollow cavern. The only object remaining in the entire house was a single, motorized hospital bed. I drove my chair into the grand living room and carefully transferred myself onto the mattress. I positioned the bed dead center in the massive echoing space. I lay back against the stark white pillows, surrounded by nothing but bare walls and creeping shadows waiting for Friday night. Friday morning broke with a sharp, blinding clarity. The early sunlight spilled through the massive, unadorned windows of the grand living room, casting long, uninterrupted shadows across the gleaming hardwood floors. I woke up on my motorized medical mattress, positioned dead center in the cavernous, echoing void of my 10,000 square foot estate. The absolute emptiness of the space was exhilarating. It was a blank canvas wiped clean of Jared's parasitic influence and ready for the final, devastating phase of my operation. I checked my encrypted laptop, ignoring the dull, persistent throbbing in my fused spine. The digital clock read precisely 7 in the morning. Right on schedule, the security cameras mounted on the front stone pillars detected movement. 3 heavily tinted, unmarked black SUVs rolled up to the wrought iron gates. I remotely triggered the access protocol, watching the heavy metal doors swing open to admit my private tactical detail. The vehicles parked in a tight, disciplined formation on the circular motor court. 5 broad-shouldered men dressed in immaculate dark suits stepped out, moving with the unmistakable, hyper-vigilant precision of seasoned combat veterans. The team lead, a rugged, stone-faced man named Silas, walked briskly up the front steps. I used my remote to unlock the front door, allowing him entry. Silas stepped into the grand foyer. His sharp eyes immediately scanned the stripped, barren walls and the total absence of furniture, but his professional demeanor never wavered. He did not ask a single question about the completely empty mansion. He simply walked over to where I sat elevated on my medical bed and gave a brief, respectful nod. He announced that the perimeter was fully secured and his team was ready for their operational briefing. I handed Silas a printed single-page document. I kept my instructions brutally concise. I informed him that my husband and his extended relatives would be attempting to breach the property this weekend. I pointed to the strictly limited guest list on the clipboard, which was entirely blank. I established the absolute rule of engagement. Absolutely no one was allowed past the iron gates without my explicit real-time verbal command over the secure intercom system. I did not care if the visitors screamed threatened legal action or claimed to be the rightful owners of the estate. The physical perimeter was to remain an impenetrable fortress. Silas reviewed the instructions, gave another sharp nod of confirmation, and immediately radioed his men to take up their tactical positions around the property line. With the physical blockade firmly established, it was time to execute the digital purge. I settled back into my pillows, balancing my high-powered laptop on my lap. Jared believed he controlled this estate because he paid the monthly Wi-Fi and electricity bills. He was completely ignorant of the fact that I held the master administrative credentials for the entire integrated smart home network. I opened the primary security application and began systematically erasing his digital existence. My fingers flew across the keyboard. First, I accessed the main gate control panel. I wiped the existing entry codes and generated a newly randomized, highly complex alphanumeric sequence. Next, I intercepted the radio frequencies for the property's garage doors. With 3 swift keystrokes, I permanently deactivated Jared's personalized clicker. He could press that button until his thumb bled and the doors would remain sealed shut like a bank vault. I then moved to the estate's primary points of entry. The house utilized state-of-the-art biometric locks. I accessed the user database, found Jared's profile, and ruthlessly deleted his saved fingerprint data. He was officially unrecognized by the very doors he planned to proudly open for his mother and sister. Finally, I recalibrated the perimeter security alarms, shifting them to a highly sensitive lockdown mode that would instantly trigger a deafening siren if anyone attempted to hop the stone walls or tamper with the keypad housings. In less than 20 minutes, Jared was effectively rendered a digital ghost, entirely locked out of his own life without having the slightest clue. The remainder of the day passed with a tense, electrifying slowness. The empty house amplified every tiny sound. The subtle hum of my medical bed adjusting its incline, the heavy rhythmic footsteps of Silas patrolling the grand foyer, the distant calls of birds outside the massive windows. I spent the hours meticulously reviewing the encrypted dossier, containing the evidence of Jared's corporate embezzlement, ensuring every fraudulent invoice and offshore bank routing number was perfectly legible for the authorities. I ate a simple prepackaged meal Andre had left for me, conserving my physical energy for the impending confrontation. As the afternoon dragged on, the sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long, fiery streaks of orange and crimson across the bare walls of the living room. The shadows lengthened, plunging the empty corners of the mansion into deep, heavy darkness. I checked my posture, adjusting the rigid lumbar brace to support my aching spine. I was entirely ready. At precisely 6 o'clock in the evening, the sharp vibrating buzz of my cell phone shattered the heavy silence of my empty house. I glanced down at the illuminated screen resting on my blankets. It was a text message from Jared. The sheer, suffocating arrogance radiating from his brief sentence made my blood run absolute ice cold. Heading home with the notary for those insurance forms, he typed, completely oblivious to the catastrophic trap waiting for him. "Have dinner ready." I stared at his pathetic, demanding words for a long moment. He believed he was driving back to a lavishly furnished mansion to effortlessly manipulate his medicated, broken wife into signing away her most valuable asset. He was expecting a hot meal and a sweeping, unearned victory. I picked up my phone, my thumb hovering over the digital keyboard. My expression was perfectly blank, my heartbeat steady and calm. I typed out my response with slow, deliberate precision. "Everything is ready." I stared at the sent message on my smartphone screen. "Everything is ready." The words felt like the final satisfying click of a heavy deadbolt sliding into place. The grand living room was slowly swallowed by the encroaching twilight, the bare drywall painted in cold shades of bruised purple and deep indigo by the fading sun. The absolute silence of the empty mansion was a living, breathing entity. My medical bed hummed softly as I adjusted the incline, positioning myself perfectly in the dead center of the vast, echoing space. I checked the high-definition security feed on my laptop, my heart beating in a slow, steady, calculated rhythm. There was no fear left in my body, only the icy, razor-sharp anticipation of a predator watching its prey step willingly into an inescapable snare. At exactly 6:45, the sleek, aggressive headlights of Jared's luxury SUV cut through the gathering darkness at the end of the long driveway. The heavy vehicle rolled up to the towering wrought iron gates and rolled to a complete stop. Through the night vision camera, I watched him punch his familiar code into the keypad. Nothing happened. He slammed his hand against the center console and furiously punched the numbers again, his movements jerky and impatient. The heavy iron gates remained completely immovable, an unyielding physical barrier that perfectly mirrored the digital wall I had erected around his entire life. Jared lost his temper instantly. He slammed his palm against the steering wheel and laid on the horn. The harsh, blaring sound ripped through the quiet suburban evening air, a pathetic, noisy tantrum from a man entirely used to getting exactly what he wanted without question. My phone vibrated intensely against the mattress. I let it ring 3 times, carefully modulating my breathing before tapping the screen to answer. I kept my voice low, slurring my syllables slightly to flawlessly mimic the heavy narcotic haze he fully expected me to be trapped in. I asked him what was wrong, playing the confused, heavily medicated wife to absolute perfection. Jared did not greet me. He immediately started screaming through the receiver. He demanded to know what the hell was wrong with the gate system, cursing about my supposed incompetence and whining loudly that he had an important guest waiting in the car. He ordered me to manually override the system and open the gates right this second. I let out a soft, fabricated groan, pretending to fumble weakly with the smart home application on my tablet. I told him I was trying, apologizing profusely for being so sluggish due to the surgical pain and the high dose of prescribed painkillers. I hit the remote access button. The heavy iron gates slowly swung inward. Jared hung up without another word. On the security feed, I watched his SUV accelerate aggressively up the winding driveway, throwing loose gravel into the manicured hedges. He slammed the brakes, parking haphazardly on the circular motor court. The driver's side door flew open and Jared stormed out, his face flushed dark red with extreme irritation. From the passenger side, a second figure emerged. It was exactly as Andre had warned. The man trailing behind my husband was a cheap, sleazy-looking notary wearing an ill-fitting suit, clutching a battered leather briefcase against his chest, and glancing around nervously at the imposing property. Jared did not even look at him. He marched toward the front stone steps, his posture radiating a toxic, unearned authority. He was so utterly consumed by his own monumental arrogance, so blindly focused on executing his extortion plan, that he completely failed to notice the obvious warning signs. He did not look through the tall, uncurtained windows. He did not notice the complete absence of ambient light from the usually glowing designer lamps. The heavy front double doors were unlocked. Jared did not bother to turn the handle gently. He kicked the right door open with his foot storming into the grand foyer, like a conquering king returning to claim his spoils. He immediately started yelling my name, demanding that I turn on the lights, and complaining bitterly about the utter darkness. But the moment his voice left his throat, something went terribly wrong. Instead of being absorbed by plush Persian rugs, thick velvet sofas, and heavy silk drapery, his harsh tone bounced violently off the bare drywall. The sound echoed back at him in a sharp, distorted, hollow reverberation that belonged in an abandoned commercial warehouse, not a 10,000-square-foot luxury residential estate. Jared froze in his tracks. He stood perfectly still in the entryway, the sleazy notary bumping directly into his back with a startled grunt. Jared blinked his eyes, slowly adjusting to the dim moonlight filtering through the bare glass windows. He stepped forward into the grand living room and stopped dead. The opulent mansion he had bragged about to his colleagues, the lavish venue he had promised to his entitled sister for her lifestyle brand launch, was completely, utterly empty. The custom mahogany furniture was gone. The imported artwork was gone. The crystal chandeliers had been stripped of their bulbs. It was a barren, echoing cavern of exposed hardwood and pristine white paint. His jaw went slack. The briefcase clutching notary let out a low, nervous whistle, clearly realizing he had walked into a highly volatile situation. Jared slowly turned his head, his wide, panicked eyes sweeping the vast emptiness of the room, until his gaze finally landed directly on me. I sat elevated on my motorized medical bed, positioned like a fortress island in the middle of the empty ocean of hardwood. I wore a dark silk lounger over my rigid spinal brace, my expression completely void of the docile, drugged compliance he had been banking on. I stared back at him, my eyes sharp, clear, and completely sober. Jared opened his mouth to speak, his brain desperately scrambling to process the catastrophic failure of his master plan. But the words never materialized. Before he could demand a single explanation, a heavy, synchronized shifting of footsteps echoed from the shadows. Silas and another massive, heavily armed security guard stepped silently out of the pitch-black void of the empty dining room. They moved with terrifying, lethal grace, their broad shoulders instantly blocking the front entryway. They crossed their thick arms over their black tactical vests, their cold professional stares locking directly onto Jared. The trap had officially snapped shut and my husband was now hopelessly sealed inside. Jared stood frozen in the grand foyer, his eyes darting frantically between the two towering security guards blocking his exit and my motorized medical bed positioned perfectly in the center of the barren living room. The silence in the cavernous space was suffocating and heavy. For a tense moment, the only sound was the heavy breathing of the tactical detail. Then the initial shock holding my husband paralyzed finally shattered, instantly replaced by a volatile, frantic rage. His face contorted into a mask of pure fury as he marched toward the center of the room, his expensive leather shoes echoing loudly against the exposed, bare hardwood floors. He threw his arms out, gesturing wildly at the empty walls, the stripped windows, and the vast hollow void where our custom furniture used to sit. He screamed at the top of his lungs, demanding to know what had happened to the house. He accused me of completely losing my mind, claiming my painkillers had triggered a severe psychotic break. He demanded to know where the imported rugs were and what kind of insane stunt I was pulling just hours before his precious family arrived. I leaned back against the stark white pillows of my medical bed, keeping my expression perfectly placid. I let my eyelids droop slightly, maintaining the facade of the confused, heavily medicated wife he desperately wanted me to be. I kept my voice soft and deliberately slow. I told him I was simply following his strict instructions to the letter. I reminded him that he had demanded the estate be absolutely perfect for the arrival of his mother, his sister, and the 23 other relatives. I explained with innocent bewilderment that packing 24 people into the house required massive logistical adjustments. I claimed I hired a storage company to remove all the luxury furniture because I genuinely thought his family needed maximum open space to feel comfortable during their stay. Jared stared at me, his chest heaving as he struggled to process the sheer absurdity of my excuse. The veins in his neck bulged against his tailored collar. He opened his mouth to scream another insult, but abruptly stopped. The panic of his ticking clock overrode his outrage over the missing furniture. He did not have time to argue about the empty house. His fraudulent financial house of cards was teetering on the edge of a catastrophic collapse, and he needed a massive injection of liquid capital immediately. He turned to the notary, who was sweating profusely and clutching his battered briefcase near the entryway. Jared snapped his fingers impatiently, ordering the man to quickly bring the documents forward. He marched right up to the edge of my medical bed and shoved a thick stack of legal papers directly onto my lap. His demeanor shifted rapidly from screaming rage to a frantic patronizing urgency. He leaned over me, his voice dripping with a false manipulative reassurance. He claimed the papers were routine insurance liability forms required for hosting so many guests on the property. He said our insurance broker needed my signature immediately to ensure we were fully covered against any potential accidents. Then, with a sickeningly smooth pivot, he casually mentioned there was also a standard tax transfer document tucked in the back. He lied right to my face, claiming his accountant advised him to shift the estate into a newly formed limited liability company to protect our marital assets and lower our property taxes. He pulled an expensive fountain pen from his breast pocket and pressed it into my hand, urging me to just sign the dotted lines quickly so he could get the paperwork filed before the weekend. He promised he would handle the boring details so I could rest. I looked down at the heavy stack of documents resting on my legs. I did not pick up the pen. Instead, the confused, foggy expression completely vanished from my face. I sat up straight, ignoring the dull throb in my fused spine, and met his frantic, lying eyes with a gaze of absolute sub-zero ice. I calmly flipped past the fake insurance cover pages, pulling out the official legally binding quitclaim deed, hidden at the very bottom of the stack. I held the document up, a cold, predatory smile slowly curving my lips. I read the receiving party's corporate registration name aloud, my voice echoing sharply in the empty room. I pointed out that the receiving entity did not belong to a joint marital trust, nor did it belong to any tax sheltering program. I stated clearly that the limited liability company listed on the deed was registered exclusively to Brittany. Jared visibly recoiled, the color draining entirely from his face. His confident, manipulative swagger instantly evaporated. I did not stop there. I dropped the paperwork onto the mattress and methodically dismantled his entire conspiracy. I told him I knew this weekend was not a simple family reunion. I detailed my exact knowledge of Brittany's extravagant, over-the-top wedding and the highly publicized launch of her luxury lifestyle brand. I recited the exact timeline of his plot, with his mother exposing their vile plan to drug me into compliance and steal my most valuable asset right out from under me. The sleazy notary stood frozen near the grand foyer. He possessed a keen sense for self-preservation. He looked at my cold, calculated expression, then glanced at the two massive, heavily armed security guards who had subtly stepped forward from the shadows, their hands resting near their tactical belts. The shady notary realized instantly he had been dragged into a highly illegal extortion attempt that was failing spectacularly. Terrified of losing his legal license and facing federal conspiracy charges, he made a split-second decision. He dropped his battered briefcase onto the bare hardwood floor, spun on his heel, and sprinted out the front door into the darkness. Jared was left standing there, entirely alone, completely exposed and utterly powerless. The heavy oak front door slammed shut behind the fleeing notary, echoing like a gunshot through the barren foyer. Jared stood paralyzed. He stared at the empty space where his accomplice had just been, his brain violently misfiring as the reality of his catastrophic failure registered. He whipped his head toward me. The patronizing mask he wore moments ago dissolved, replaced by feral panic. He looked at the quitclaim deed resting untouched on my lap, then up at my calm, unyielding expression. His desperation abruptly mutated into blinding, frantic rage. He let out a guttural roar and lunged across the exposed floor. He threw his body weight toward my motorized bed. His hands extended violently, attempting to grab my wrist and force the pen into my fingers. Blinded by the terrifying reality of impending financial ruin, he completely ignored his own safety. But he never made it within arm's reach of the mattress. Silas and his tactical partner moved with terrifying precision, closing the distance in a fraction of a second. Silas intercepted my husband mid-lunge, driving a heavy shoulder directly into Jared's chest. The impact lifted Jared entirely off his feet. He crashed onto the unforgiving bare floorboards with a sickening thud. Before Jared could gasp for breath, the two veterans seamlessly flipped him onto his stomach. They drove their knees firmly into his upper back, brutally pinning his arms behind him in an inescapable submission hold. Jared thrashed wildly, his face pressed painfully against the cold wood. He spat out strings of furious insults, demanding the guards release him immediately and threatening to sue for assault. His pathetic struggling was completely useless against the seasoned professionals. Over the sound of his frantic screaming, the sharp rhythmic clicking of high heels echoed from the back of the house. From the heavy shadows of the entirely stripped kitchen, a new figure emerged. It was Veronica, my relentlessly cutthroat family law attorney. She walked into the dim moonlight of the grand living room wearing an immaculate designer suit, clutching a thick stack of heavily tabbed manila folders against her chest. She approached the center of the room, stopping just inches from where Jared lay pinned. She looked down at him with an expression of pure professional disgust. She calmly introduced herself, her voice carrying an icy authority that instantly commanded the vast space. Crouching down slightly to ensure he could see her face, she formally served him. She dropped the first document directly beside his cheek, informing him it was an immediate filing for absolute divorce, citing severe financial infidelity and irreconcilable malice. She dropped the second document onto the pile. She stated it was a temporary, strictly enforced restraining order, barring him from coming within 500 feet of my physical person. Then she dropped the final envelope right in front of his eyes. She explicitly detailed that it was a formal, legally binding eviction notice. Jared stopped his frantic thrashing for a fraction of a second, his eyes widening as he stared at the stack of legal paperwork resting on the floorboards. Then a fresh wave of arrogant delusion washed over him. He began struggling again, twisting his neck to scream up at Veronica. He loudly demanded to know what kind of scam she was running. He bellowed that she could not possibly evict a man from his own primary residence. He confidently bragged that he was my legal spouse, insisting he possessed a fundamental right to half the equity of the massive estate. He shouted that any judge would immediately throw her fake eviction notice out of court and award him full possession of the property. Veronica did not flinch. She adjusted her glasses and delivered the most brutal, methodical reality check of his entire life. She used her sharpest, condescending legal tone to completely dismantle his pathetic fantasy. She explicitly reminded him that he had absolutely zero equity in the property. She laid out the impenetrable corporate structure, explaining that a private holding company owned the physical estate, and I was the sole owner of that corporate entity. She emphasized that Jared had never contributed a single cent to the mortgage, the down payment, or the property taxes. She coldly defined his actual legal status. He was not a homeowner. He was not an investor. He had legally been classified as a mere month-to-month tenant for the entire duration of our marriage. As of this exact moment, his tenancy was permanently terminated. The absolute finality of her words finally penetrated Jared's thick skull. He stopped fighting against the heavy knees pinning him to the floor. His body went entirely limp for a breathless moment. Then a dark, deeply unsettling sound erupted from his throat. He began to laugh. It started as a low, wet chuckle and rapidly escalated into a maniacal, unhinged roar that bounced terrifyingly off the bare walls of the empty mansion. He twisted his head, spitting with sheer rage, and locked his wild, frantic eyes directly onto mine. He screamed that my pathetic legal ambush was going to fail spectacularly. He violently reminded me that his mother, his sister, and 23 other extended relatives were arriving tomorrow morning bright and early. He boasted loudly that an entire mob of 25 furious family members would be standing right behind him. He promised with absolute certainty that local law enforcement would arrive, take one look at the situation, and immediately side with a successful husband trying to manage a crazy medicated wife. I sat perfectly elevated on my medical bed, my posture completely relaxed. I did not offer him a single word of response. I simply maintained my cold, dead stare and gave Silas one sharp, definitive nod. The two security veterans instantly hauled Jared up by his armpits. They dragged his thrashing, screaming body across the grand foyer, physically threw him out the heavy front doors, and tossed him violently onto the cold driveway gravel. Saturday morning broke with a crisp, cold brightness that washed perfectly over the barren floors of the empty grand living room. The violent chaos of the previous evening had completely dissipated, leaving behind a profound and absolute stillness. After my security detail hurled my treacherous husband onto the cold gravel of the driveway, I finally managed to achieve something that had eluded me for days. I slept soundly. I woke up feeling remarkably revitalized, my mind razor-sharp and my physical pain fully under control, thanks to a precise schedule of medication. The restrictive lumbar brace encasing my healing spine was concealed beneath an elegant dark emerald silk lounger. The luxurious fabric cascaded over the edges of my motorized medical mattress, completely transforming the clinical nature of my recovery setup. Elevated in the center of the echoing mansion, I felt less like a bedridden patient and entirely like a queen holding court in the heart of her freshly conquered empty castle. Outside the towering walls of my estate, the highly trained tactical security team executed my lockdown protocols with flawless military precision. Silas, the stoic team lead, conducted a rigorous morning patrol around the entire property line. He ensured the wrought iron front gates were heavily barricaded and locked down against any external force. I watched his men take up their strategic positions, their broad shoulders and dark suits standing out starkly against the manicured green hedges. They formed a silent, strong human shield between my private sanctuary and the impending toxic invasion. From my command post on the mattress, I booted up my secure laptop and pulled up the closed-circuit television feeds. The monitor displayed a grid of 12 different camera angles, granting me total, unobstructed visibility of every possible approach to the property. With the entire perimeter fortified, I turned my attention to the internal communication infrastructure. The rapid response movers who stripped my home the day before had left behind one specific piece of equipment at my request. Resting on the bare hardwood floor of the grand foyer, directly facing the double doors, was a massive industrial-grade Bluetooth speaker system. It was the kind of high-fidelity audio equipment typically utilized for outdoor concerts or large corporate presentations. I picked up my smartphone and paired it with the towering black speaker, adjusting the output settings to their maximum decibel capacity. I ran a brief diagnostic test, sending a low, vibrating pulse through the wireless connection. The heavy bass thrummed against the bare drywall, the sound waves rebounding violently through the empty, cavernous hallways. The acoustic power was magnificent. Every single syllable I chose to broadcast would be amplified into an inescapable, booming declaration. The hours ticked by with a tense electric anticipation. I sat perfectly still, my eyes scanning the video feeds, completely detached from any lingering emotional connection to the people about to arrive. For years, I had quietly endured the condescending remarks, the subtle financial manipulations, and the suffocating entitlement that defined my husband's family dynamics. I had watched Catherine parade around as the undisputed matriarch while treating me as nothing more than a convenient source of funding. I had observed Brittany leverage her brother's stolen corporate authority to bankroll a fraudulent lifestyle brand. They truly believed they could march onto my property, exploit my surgical vulnerability, and strip me of my most valuable asset without facing a single repercussion. They were walking blindly into a meticulously designed financial and social guillotine, and I was firmly holding the heavy release lever. At exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, the digital motion sensors on the outermost street cameras triggered a silent alert on my laptop screen. The decisive moment had officially arrived. I leaned forward, my gaze locking onto the primary monitor. A slow, highly coordinated convoy of 6 pristine luxury sport utility vehicles turned onto the quiet, affluent suburban street. The massive black vehicles rolled up the asphalt in a tight, arrogant formation, looking less like a family gathering and more like a hostile corporate takeover. I knew instantly that the entire fleet of premium rental cars had been secured using Jared's completely maxed out credit cards. He had leveraged his last remaining shreds of stolen corporate funds to ensure his mother and sister arrived in the exact opulent style they perpetually demanded. The convoy slowed to a halt, the drivers aligning the heavy vehicles parallel to my barricaded iron gates. The heavy doors of the 6 luxury vehicles swung open in rapid succession. A sprawling, chaotic swarm of 25 people spilled out onto the public sidewalk. Catherine and Brittany emerged from the lead vehicle, leading the charge with an air of supreme, unquestionable authority. The rest of the extended relatives followed closely behind a massive crowd of aunts, uncles, and cousins who had eagerly signed up for a free, fully catered luxury vacation at my personal expense. They were all dressed in expensive, brightly colored resort wear, completely outfitted for a lavish summer holiday. The sheer volume of people crowding the street was staggering, a literal invading army of entitlement and blinding greed. The relatives immediately began hauling an endless parade of massive, oversized designer suitcases out of the spacious vehicle trunks. They dragged the extremely heavy luggage across the pavement, chatting loudly and laughing together with the absolute certainty that they were about to spend 2 glorious weeks lounging by my private pool and being served gourmet meals in my grand dining room. Catherine adjusted her designer sunglasses and marched proudly to the very front of the pack, motioning for Brittany to join her at the entrance. They approached the towering wrought iron barricade, fully expecting the heavy gates to magically part for them without delay. Catherine reached out with a perfectly manicured finger and impatiently pressed the heavy brass buzzer, eagerly waiting for the seamless, luxurious hospitality she believed she was rightfully owed today. Catherine pressed the brass buzzer again, the tone ringing uselessly against the stone pillars. When the massive iron gates did not swing open, her entitled smile faltered. From the rear of the luxury vehicle convoy, Jared stomped heavily up the concrete public sidewalk to join his mother and sister. He looked absolutely atrocious, completely shattering his curated image of a highly successful tech director. His expensive designer suit was deeply wrinkled and stained, smelling faintly of the stale air and cheap coffee from inside his rental car where he had been forced to sleep. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with dark, exhausted circles, and his monumental ego was still severely bruised from being violently thrown off his own driveway the night before. He shoved past his confused aunts and uncles marching directly up to the front security keypad. He frantically punched his old access code into the system, stabbing the metallic buttons with rigid, angry fingers. A harsh, bright red error light flashed rapidly on the digital display, accompanied by a low, rejecting buzz. Brittany immediately began to panic, her influencer persona cracking. She stomped her sandals against the pavement and complained loudly to her mother about the delay. She whined that her makeup artist, styling team, and premium event caterers were arriving in less than an hour. She gestured toward the locked gates, insisting the venue needed to be completely prepped for her brand launch, and that standing outside ruined her curated aesthetic. She demanded Jared fix the broken gate immediately. Jared slammed the heel of his hand against the keypad housing in a fit of impotent rage, his face turning a dangerous, volatile shade of crimson. He began shouting violently through the iron bars, demanding entry and acting for the benefit of his watching relatives, as if a simple technical glitch was keeping them all outside. From the shadows of the hedges, Silas emerged. The imposing leader of my private tactical detail walked down the long driveway with slow, highly intimidating steps. He wore a crisp, dark suit stretched over a tactical vest, his posture radiating absolute, unflinching authority. He held a thick metal clipboard in one hand, his gaze locked coldly on the unruly crowd. The agitated murmuring of the extended relatives fell dead silent as the towering security veteran approached the barricade. Catherine immediately puffed up her chest, attempting to aggressively pull rank on a man she assumed was a mere neighborhood patrolman. She imperiously instructed the guard to open the gates for the rightful owners of the house, waving her hand as if dismissing a stubborn servant. Silas did not flinch, nor did he reach for the gate controls. He looked directly through the thick iron bars and addressed the entire crowd with a booming, commanding voice that left absolutely no room for negotiation. He formally announced that the sprawling estate was private corporate-owned property. He stated clearly that not a single person standing in the crowd was on the approved access list. He warned them they were actively trespassing on a highly secured perimeter and advised them to step back. A massive wave of agitated confusion rippled rapidly through the 23 extended relatives standing stranded on the public sidewalk. Uncles exchanged bewildered, angry glances. Cousins began whispering frantically to one another, pointing at the imposing guard. They turned their collective questioning gaze toward Jared and Catherine, their frustration mounting rapidly. They demanded to know why they were locked out of what had been promised as a welcoming family home. They asked why heavily armed men were guarding a simple vacation house, and why they were being treated like hostile intruders after flying across the country. The grand illusion of Jared's hospitable wealth was rapidly cracking under the heavy weight of reality. Jared panicked wildly, sweat beading on his forehead. He desperately tried to salvage his facade by spinning a frantic narrative. He turned to his family and screamed that his wife was having a severe, medication-induced mental breakdown following her recent spinal surgery. He lied, telling his aunts and uncles I had lost my mind, hired random thugs, and barricaded myself inside in a fit of surgical paranoia. He promised the increasingly hostile crowd he would sort out the crazy misunderstanding immediately and get them inside to their luxury guest rooms. Catherine, unwilling to be humiliated for another second in front of her extended family, pushed her way aggressively to the very front of the iron gates. She grabbed the cold metal bars, her knuckles turning stark white, and glared viciously at Silas. She demanded to speak directly to the hired help over the intercom, treating the seasoned security professional with absolute venom. She insisted that she was the matriarch of the family and would absolutely not be kept waiting on a public curb like a commoner. Up in my command post, resting comfortably on my motorized medical bed, I watched her suffocating entitlement radiate through the high-definition camera feed. I leaned forward, ignoring the dull ache in my spine, and pressed the microphone button on my laptop. I routed my audio directly into the massive industrial Bluetooth speaker positioned in the empty grand foyer, which seamlessly echoed out to the external gate intercom system. My calm, unwavering voice boomed through the outdoor speakers, cutting sharply through the chaotic murmuring of the stranded crowd. I did not greet them or apologize for the delay. I simply announced the new non-negotiable terms of their arrival. I stated that the gates would open temporarily, but I would allow exactly 3 people onto the property. I named Jared, Catherine, and Brittany. I then delivered the final, devastating restriction, instructing the other 22 bewildered relatives that they were strictly forbidden from crossing the property line and must remain exactly where they were on the public sidewalk. The wrought iron gates groaned as I triggered the remote release. They parted just a fraction, creating a narrow gap barely wide enough for a single person. Outside on the crowded public sidewalk, the bewildered extended family watched in silence. Jared immediately squeezed through the opening, his face flushed with a mixture of profound embarrassment and boiling rage. Catherine followed close behind him, hiking up her expensive trousers to avoid the metal bars. Brittany pushed through last, clutching a designer tote bag and glaring venomously at the security guards. The moment her sandal cleared the threshold, Silas signaled his men. The heavy gates violently slammed shut, the electronic deadbolts engaging with a loud, definitive crack that left the other 22 relatives stranded entirely on the outside. The toxic trio did not bother to look back at the family they had just abandoned on the curb. They turned their sights entirely on my house, marching up the long, winding driveway with an air of breathtaking entitlement. From my elevated position on the medical bed, I watched their approach through the high-definition security feed on my laptop. Catherine complained loudly about the uneven gravel scuffing her imported heels. Brittany whined incessantly about the severe humidity ruining her hair, frantically reminding her brother that her elite bridal makeup team was scheduled to arrive in less than 30 minutes. Jared marched slightly ahead of them, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He was boldly promising his mother and sister that he would immediately put an end to my pathetic medicated rebellion. He assured them he would force me to open the gates for the rest of the family and make sure the venue was prepped for the upcoming festivities. They were fully intending to bully me into absolute submission. They reached the grand front steps. Jared did not bother knocking. He grabbed the heavy brass handles of the double doors and shoved them open with unearned authority. He stormed into the grand foyer, drawing a deep breath to unleash verbal abuse. But the harsh, commanding words instantly died in his throat. Catherine and Brittany pushed past him, ready to start barking orders about their luggage and room assignments. They stepped over the threshold and stopped dead in their tracks. The visual impact of the completely barren mansion hit them like a physical blow. The warm, opulent sanctuary they had eagerly expected to conquer did not exist. There were no crystal chandeliers dripping with light. There were no plush velvet sofas waiting for them to lounge on. There was absolutely nothing but bare drywall, exposed floorboards, and a cold, sterile emptiness that stretched across 10,000 square feet. Jared had seen the devastating reality of the stripped house the night before, but watching his mother and sister absorb the shock triggered a fresh wave of panic within him. Catherine took 2 shaky steps into the grand living room. Her eyes darted wildly around the vast, hollow space. She looked down at the gleaming hardwood floors, her meticulously manicured hands trembling. She let out a sharp, piercing shriek that bounced violently off the bare walls. She demanded to know where the antique Persian rugs were. She screamed questions about the custom mahogany dining table and the imported Italian leather armchairs she had planned to show off to her country club friends. Her voice echoed endlessly in the cavernous space, twisting her demands into a pathetic, distorted wail. Brittany's reaction was far more visceral. She walked slowly past her mother, her mouth hanging open in absolute horror. She stared at the blank walls where my expensive artwork used to hang. She looked at the empty corners where elaborate floral arrangements were supposed to be staged. The pristine, highly curated background she required for her luxury lifestyle brand and her extravagant wedding was entirely gone. The heavy designer tote bag slipped from her shoulder, hitting the hardwood floor with a sharp, echoing smack. The reality of her shattered delusion crashed down on her. Her picturesque free wedding venue was nothing but a hollow chamber of nothingness. Brittany launched into a full-blown hysterical meltdown. She dropped to her knees, clutching her head and screaming that her entire life was ruined. She shrieked about her celebrity event planners, the Michelin-starred caterers, and the hundreds of wealthy guests she had invited to this exact address. She wailed that she could not possibly host a high-society launch party in an empty, echoing box. Her shrill cries mingled with Catherine's furious demands, creating a chaotic, deafening cacophony of shattered entitlement and broken egos. Through their blinding rage and theatrical sobbing, they finally looked toward the center of the vast room. I sat perfectly still on my motorized medical bed, the dark emerald silk of my lounger draped elegantly over my rigid spinal brace. I looked down at them with absolute chilling serenity. The sheer contrast between their frantic, screaming meltdown and my immovable, stony silence was staggering. Catherine's eyes locked onto mine. Her face twisted with pure venom as she marched toward the mattress, demanding I immediately explain what I had done to her son's beautiful house. Jared scrambled closely behind her, his face pale, begging his mother to stop. He knew exactly what I was capable of doing, but Catherine and Brittany were still completely blind to the depth of their peril. Brittany screamed from the floor, demanding I pay to replace every single piece of missing furniture before her vendors arrived. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match their hysterical shouting. I simply maintained my cold, dead stare. Slowly, deliberately, I raised my right hand. I held up my smartphone, the screen glowing brightly with the active audio interface. Then I raised my left hand. I held up the thick, heavy manila folder containing the forensic audit. I looked directly into Jared's terrified eyes, signaling that the empty house was merely a prologue. The real destruction had not even begun. The phone and the manila folder hovered in my hands, a silent promise of absolute ruin. For a fraction of a second, the three intruders simply stared at me, their brains violently stalling as they tried to comprehend my utter lack of fear. The sight of my cold, calculated serenity finally broke whatever fragile tether of sanity Catherine still possessed. The loss of her luxurious vacation, the destruction of her carefully curated aesthetic, and my blatant refusal to submit to her authority caused her to completely unravel. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered hatred. She let out a guttural shriek, a sound so vile it hardly seemed human, and threw herself forward. She abandoned all pretense of wealthy suburban sophistication, curling her manicured hands into claws as she lunged directly toward my medical bed. She screamed that I had maliciously ruined Brittany's entire life, blaming me for sabotaging the brand launch and destroying their family. Her eyes were wide and frantic, her body propelled entirely by a desperate, violent urge to physically drag me off the mattress and force me into submission. She never made it past the edge of the bare hardwood. Silas moved with the terrifying, fluid speed of a seasoned combat veteran. He and his tactical partner stepped seamlessly out of the shadows, instantly forming an impenetrable physical wall between my medical bed and my unhinged mother-in-law. Silas simply planted his broad shoulders and braced his core. Catherine crashed hard into his solid, unyielding chest. The impact knocked the wind completely out of her lungs. Silas easily deflected her flailing arms, grabbing her by the shoulders and forcefully shoving her backward. She stumbled clumsily over her expensive designer heels, nearly falling onto the exposed floorboards before Jared scrambled forward to catch her. Jared held his gasping mother, his face drained of color. Finally recognizing his physical intimidation, tactics were entirely useless against an elite security detail. They were completely contained, stripped of their power, and totally at my mercy. I slowly lowered the manila folder onto my lap, keeping my eyes locked dead onto Catherine's terrified face. I raised my smartphone. I did not offer them a single warning. I simply tapped the center of the illuminated screen. Instantly, a sharp, piercing hiss of static erupted from the massive industrial-grade Bluetooth speaker positioned in the grand foyer. The volume was set to its absolute maximum capacity. Without the heavy velvet drapes and thick Persian rugs to absorb the sound, the acoustic resonance in the stripped mansion was deafening. The static cleared, replaced immediately by the crisp, unmistakable sound of clinking silverware and pouring wine. Then Brittany's shrill, recorded voice bounced violently off the bare drywall. She was complaining about the floral arrangements for her upcoming wedding and brand launch. Brittany physically recoiled, covering her mouth with her hands as she heard her own recorded voice echoing through the empty house. But the true devastation arrived a second later. The recording captured Catherine's domineering tone, asking Jared if the property transfer logistics were finalized. Then came Jared's arrogant reply, bragging about gifting my multi-million-dollar estate to his sister. Jared visibly stopped breathing. He stared at the giant speaker in the foyer, his eyes bulging in horror as he realized exactly what I was playing. The audio continued, relentlessly exposing the darkest, most predatory core of their conspiracy. The speakers blasted Catherine's venomous instructions, detailing her strategy to weaponize my high-risk spinal fusion surgery. She explicitly instructed Jared to ambush me with a notary on Friday night, banking entirely on my prescribed narcotics to render me docile and compliant. The three of them stood paralyzed, forced to listen to the grotesque reality of their own criminal plotting. The recording broadcasted Jared's dark, mocking laughter. It amplified his cruel jokes about my physical weakness, his horrific bragging about how easy it would be to manipulate a bedridden woman into signing a quitclaim deed. Every single vile, extortionist syllable they had spoken at their private family dinner was now echoing like thunder around them. Brittany collapsed against the wall, sliding down to the floor as she realized the depth of her complicity was fully documented. Jared looked as though he was going to violently empty his stomach, his knees shaking. Catherine's face transformed from flushed rage to a sickening chalky gray. The pristine, pious matriarchal image she had spent decades cultivating was being systematically pulverized by her own recorded words. But I was not finished. Their private humiliation inside the empty mansion was merely the first phase of their punishment. I reached for my encrypted tablet resting beside me on the mattress. I accessed the primary smart home control panel and navigated to the external intercom routing system. I did not stop the audio playing in the foyer. Instead, I simply toggled a secondary switch, mirroring the Bluetooth audio output directly to the high-fidelity security speakers mounted on the iron front gates. Outside on the public sidewalk, the remaining 22 extended relatives were still furiously murmuring angrily, waiting for Jared to resolve the supposed technical glitch. Suddenly, the external speakers crackled to life, projecting the damning audio recording into the crisp morning air with crystal-clear precision. The aunts, uncles, and cousins fell silent, their heads snapping toward the iron gates. They stood frozen on the pavement, captivated and horrified by the voices blasting from the security system. They heard Catherine orchestrating the theft of my property. They heard Jared laughing maliciously about drugging his recovering wife. They heard the undeniable premeditated evidence of a felony extortion plot designed to fund Brittany's vanity project. The carefully crafted illusion of Catherine as a loving, generous mother and Jared as a highly successful, devoted husband shattered instantly into a million irreparable pieces. The family outside gasped in collective horror, the devastating truth of their criminality ringing loudly across the quiet suburban street. The collective gasp from the sidewalk penetrated the thick walls of the empty house. Jared stood frozen as the voices of his stunned aunts and uncles echoed from the street. The heavy silence inside the grand living room was thick enough to choke on. The reality of his absolute public ruin was sinking in, but instead of showing an ounce of remorse, his monumental arrogance violently took over. He refused to accept defeat. His bruised ego demanded a defense, a desperate attempt to claw back some shred of his shattered superiority. His face flushed a deep mottled red. He balled his hands into tight fists and stepped toward my medical bed, his chest heaving. He completely ignored the towering security guards flanking me. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face and unleashed a torrent of vicious, unhinged insults. He screamed that I was nothing but a pathetic, bedridden parasite. He yelled that he was the true breadwinner of this household, the highly successful tech director who carried the entire financial weight of our marriage, while I played with spreadsheets. He aggressively beat his chest, shouting that he was the one who paid for Brittany's extravagant wedding funding, every single luxurious detail from the designer dress to the custom floral arrangements. He boasted loudly about securing the fleet of luxury vehicles currently parked outside, claiming his superior credit and massive income made this entire family gathering possible. He bragged about funding his mother's elite country club memberships, claiming he provided a lifestyle of wealth and privilege that I could never possibly comprehend or replicate on my own. He called me a bitter, jealous woman who was desperately trying to tear down a self-made man out of pure, unadulterated spite. I let him scream until his voice grew hoarse and his face dripped with nervous sweat. I let him expend his remaining energy on a fabricated narrative that was about to be obliterated by undeniable facts. I looked down at the heavy manila folder resting on the dark green silk of my lounger. I slowly peeled back the metal clasp and opened the cover, revealing pages of damning financial records. I did not raise my voice or attempt to shout over his ridiculous tantrum. I did not show a single flicker of emotion. I simply began to read the cold, hard numbers, letting the absolute truth cut through his hysterical lies. I read aloud his exact base salary down to the final dollar. I listed his commission caps and detailed the precise amount of taxes deducted from his paychecks. I watched his furious ranting stutter to a halt. I contrasted his heavily taxed income with the hundreds of thousands of dollars he had spent over the last 6 months. I outlined the $85,000 sports car he bought for his sister. I listed the $50,000 catering deposit, the $40,000 floral budget, and the country club initiation fees. I looked up from the documents and met his panicked eyes. I told him the math was completely impossible. I stated clearly that a mid-level sales director could not fund the lifestyle of a multimillionaire without engaging in severe financial misconduct. The color drained from his flushed face, replaced by a sickly ashen gray. His jaw slackened. The frantic defensive energy evaporated, leaving behind a terrified hollow shell of a man. I pulled a thick stack of stapled papers from the folder, the crisp white sheets contrasting sharply with the dark room. I held up the comprehensive forensic audit report, letting him see his signature printed on the fraudulent approvals. I told him I knew exactly how he was paying for his family's delusions of grandeur. I detailed the sophisticated embezzlement scheme he had been running with reckless abandon for the past 8 months. I listed the specific names of the fake technology vendors he had created to bypass the internal accounting controls. I recited the exact dates and amounts of the unauthorized wire transfers he had approved using his director-level security clearance. I explained how he had systematically siphoned corporate funds from his employer, bleeding their quarterly budget dry, and funneled the stolen cash directly into offshore accounts registered to his sister's fake lifestyle brand. Catherine let out a sharp, choked gasp, backing away from her son, as if he had suddenly caught fire. Brittany sank lower against the bare drywall, her hands covering her face, as the full extent of her criminal liability was laid bare. Jared shook his head wildly, stumbling backward. He stammered, attempting to deny the accusations, claiming my documents were entirely fabricated. He insisted I was just a low-level accountant who could never access that kind of restricted corporate data. I smiled. It was a cold, razor-sharp smile that held absolutely no warmth. I reminded him that my independent analytics firm was not a group of low-level accountants. I reminded him that my company held the primary auditing contract for the massive parent corporation that owned his tech firm. I had the highest level administrative access to his corporate ledgers, and his digital footprints were scattered everywhere. Jared swayed on his feet, his breathing turning rapid and shallow. He looked at the heavy folder in my hands, finally realizing the catastrophic magnitude of his miscalculation. He had attempted to steal a house from a woman who tracked stolen money for a living. He choked out a desperate, pleading whisper, begging me to keep the files private. He promised he could secure a massive loan, replace the missing corporate funds, and make everything right if I just kept the audit a secret between us. He promised we could fix this. My smile widened, feeling a profound, absolute wave of satisfaction wash over my recovering body as the trap perfectly snapped shut. I looked him dead in the eye and delivered the ultimate fatal blow. I told him there was no way to keep it a secret or strike a backroom deal. I revealed that I had not just compiled the evidence for my own personal amusement or marital leverage. I informed him that at precisely 8 o'clock this morning, I had attached the unredacted forensic audit complete with all offshore bank routing numbers and fraudulent vendor invoices to a highly secure email. I told him I sent that email directly to the executive board of directors at his parent company, ensuring every senior partner saw his crimes. I paused, letting the silence stretch, for a terrible, agonizing second before delivering the final devastating sentence. I told him I had also copied the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation on that exact same email, triggering an immediate federal inquiry. The blood rapidly drained from Jared's face, leaving behind a sickening pallor mirroring the bare walls of the empty mansion. The full, catastrophic weight of my final sentence slammed into him with the force of a speeding freight train. The Federal Bureau of Investigation. Those 5 words completely shattered his reality. He stood rigid for a fraction of a second, his eyes wide and unblinking, before his physical body simply gave out. His knees buckled entirely. He dropped straight down, his kneecaps hitting the exposed hardwood floor with a sharp, sickening crack, echoing through the cavernous grand living room. He did not attempt to catch himself. He collapsed forward onto his hands, his expensive tailored suit bunching around his shaking shoulders. He began to hyperventilate. Harsh, ragged gasps ripped from his throat as he struggled pulling oxygen into his lungs. The arrogant sales director who marched into my home intending to steal my estate was completely gone. In his place was a broken, terrified criminal, realizing his entire life was over. His lucrative career was instantly terminated. His stolen offshore wealth was permanently frozen. His freedom was rapidly evaporating. He clutched the collar of his dress shirt, pulling at the silk tie, as if it were a noose tightening around his neck. He looked up at me from the floorboards, his mouth opening and closing in silent, pathetic desperation, but I offered absolutely zero comfort. The oppressive silence inside the grand living room violently shattered. The toxic, unconditional family loyalty, protecting Jared for his entire life, instantly vaporized the very second personal liability entered the equation. Brittany reacted first. She did not rush to comfort her hyperventilating brother. She did not express a single ounce of sibling concern. Instead, her perfectly contoured face twisted into a mask of pure, selfish fury. She took a step toward Jared and began screaming at the top of her lungs. She shrieked that her highly anticipated luxury lifestyle brand was completely ruined. She accused him of deliberately destroying her upcoming wedding and intentionally poisoning her entire aesthetic by funding it with dirty, embezzled corporate money. She wailed her elite celebrity event planners would drop her immediately, and her curated social media following would label her a pathetic fraud. She aggressively kicked her designer sandal against the hardwood floor, furiously blaming him for turning her into the sister of a disgraced, convicted felon. She demanded to know how she was supposed to show her face in public ever again, her shrill voice echoing wildly against the stripped drywall. Catherine did not intervene to protect her golden son. The imperious matriarch spending decades enabling Jared's worst impulses and treating me with relentless disdain, completely unraveled. She ignored Jared gasping on the floorboards entirely. She collapsed against the bare drywall, clutching her chest and letting out a loud, theatrical wail. Her tears were not for her son's impending incarceration. She sobbed uncontrollably about her own shattered reputation. She cried about the elite country club memberships funded by his stolen cash. She bemoaned the utter humiliation facing her when her wealthy suburban social circle discovered her opulent lifestyle was built on a massive federal crime. She wailed about being permanently exiled from her high society luncheons, furiously lamenting how friends would ruthlessly gossip about her son, the embezzler. Watching the two women violently turn on the man who had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars just to appease them was a masterclass in narcissistic implosion. They viciously ate their own to save themselves from the impending fallout. The sheer panic was not confined to the interior of the empty mansion. Outside the heavy wrought iron gates, the situation rapidly descended into total, unmitigated chaos. Through the external security speakers, the 22 extended relatives stranded on the public sidewalk heard every single damning detail of the forensic audit. They heard the exact dollar amounts of the offshore wire transfers. They heard the devastating mention of the Financial Crimes Division. The entitled, agitated crowd of aunts, uncles, and cousins instantly transformed into a frantic, terrified mob. The prospect of a free luxury vacation evaporated instantly, replaced by the overwhelming primal urge to distance themselves from a massive federal investigation. Through my high-definition laptop monitor, I watched the absolute frenzy unfold. Relatives demanding entry moments ago were now screaming at designated drivers, turning the rented luxury SUVs around immediately. Cousins frantically grabbed heavy designer suitcases hauled onto the pavement and violently shoved them back into vehicle trunks. No one cared about the picturesque family reunion anymore. They desperately scrambled, fleeing the scene, physically pushing each other out of the way, securing a seat in the escaping convoy. They treated my heavily fortified perimeter not as a locked gate keeping them out, but as a dangerous crime scene they needed to escape at all costs. Inside the grand living room, Jared remained on his hands and knees, drowning in the chaotic crossfire of his mother's wailing and his sister's screaming. He squeezed his eyes shut, pressing his forehead against the cold floorboards as the reality of his total isolation crushed whatever remained of his spirit. I sat perfectly still on my motorized medical bed, wrapped in my dark silk lounger, watching the destruction with cold satisfaction. I had not laid a single finger on him. I had simply held up a mirror, forcing him to witness the devastating consequences of his monumental arrogance. Then a new sound sliced cleanly through the frantic yelling inside the house and the chaotic scrambling on the street. It started as a faint wail echoing over the suburban tree line, growing louder and more distinct with every passing second. The sharp shriek of heavy police sirens cut through the crisp morning air. The sound approached the estate, signaling the end of Jared's freedom. Flashes of red and blue light began reflecting wildly against the tall, bare glass windows of the grand living room, painting the empty walls in colors of ultimate retribution. Authorities had arrived. Red and blue lights painted the bare walls in chaotic strokes. The sirens abruptly cut off, replaced by the crunch of thick tires, tearing up the gravel beyond my iron gates. Silas touched his earpiece, shifting into an active tactical liaison. He gave a sharp nod and marched toward the foyer. I watched the security monitor as 4 police cruisers and 2 government sedans swarmed the street, boxing in the frantic relatives and their rented luxury vehicles. The extended family scrambled wildly out of the way, pressing against the stone pillars as armed officers and federal agents stepped out. Silas remotely disengaged the gate locks. The iron bars swung wide open, admitting the inescapable wrath of the justice system. The heavy black boots of law enforcement officers pounded a rhythmic, terrifying beat up the long concrete driveway. They did not pause to knock. The heavy double doors burst open, hitting the interior walls with a resounding crack, making Catherine shriek in sheer terror. 6 armed officers poured directly into the grand foyer, hands resting cautiously on their duty belts, silver badges catching the flashing emergency lights from outside. A broad-shouldered federal agent with piercing gray eyes stepped to the front of the pack. His voice boomed through the empty, echoing mansion, carrying absolute legal authority. He demanded Jared identify himself immediately. Jared remained paralyzed on his hands and knees on the exposed hardwood floor. The commanding shout of the federal agent seemed to violently break the final remaining thread of his sanity. He did not stand up like a confident man. He did not face the authorities with the arrogant swagger he had relentlessly weaponized against me for years. Instead, faced with the terrifying concrete reality of federal prison, he completely unraveled into pure panic. He began to crawl. He dragged his body across the floorboards, his expensive tailored suit collecting dust as he scrambled frantically toward my motorized medical bed. Tears streamed down his pale face. He reached out with trembling hands, clutching the edge of my silk lounger. He looked up from the ground, his eyes stripped of their former cruelty. He begged me to make it stop. He choked on frantic sobs, pleading with me to tell the agents it was all a massive misunderstanding. He swore he would cancel the divorce instantly. He cried out that he loved me, that he would do absolutely anything to fix this broken marriage if I called off the audit. He promised to sell his sister's luxury car, pull the wedding deposits back, and be the devoted husband I deserved. It was the most pathetic, genuinely sickening display of extreme cowardice I had ever witnessed. Catherine and Brittany stood frozen against the bare drywall, watching their golden, untouchable family patriarch grovel shamelessly like a cornered rat. They did not move a single muscle to help him. They simply stared in muted horror as the pristine facade of his immense financial success burned completely to ash. I sat perfectly elevated on my mattress, looking down at the exact man who had callously plotted to drug me, rob me blind, and discard me. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel a shred of satisfying vindication. I felt absolutely nothing. My emotional reservoir regarding this treacherous man was completely permanently dry. I did not offer him a single syllable of comforting reassurance or harsh condemnation. I slowly shifted my cold gaze away from his weeping, pathetic face and looked directly at the lead federal agent standing tall in the grand living room. I raised my right hand and pointed a single steady finger toward the thick manila folder resting on the hardwood floor just a few feet away. The agent tracked my gesture. He stepped forward with heavy boots, picked up the dense file, and briefly scanned the top page, displaying the fraudulent offshore wire transfers and the highly incriminating fake vendor invoices. He gave me a firm professional nod of silent acknowledgement. The agent signaled sharply to the waiting local officers. Two heavy-set policemen closed the remaining distance in a tiny fraction of a second. They grabbed Jared roughly by the shoulders of his ruined suit and violently yanked his dead weight clean off the floor. Jared screamed loudly, thrashing wildly in midair as they forcefully twisted his arms behind his back. The sharp, unmistakable click of heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed loudly in the cavernous room. The lead agent stepped directly in front of my sobbing husband and began officially reading him his Miranda rights, his booming voice completely drowning out Catherine's sudden hysterical wailing. She dropped dramatically to her knees, screaming for the officers to let her precious boy go, but the tactical security guards firmly blocked her path, keeping her contained against the bare wall. The officers did not waste any time entertaining the theatrical family drama unfolding. They forcefully marched Jared straight out of the grand living room, dragging his stumbling, handcuffed body back through the foyer and out the heavy front doors. The cool morning air hit them as they descended the front stone steps. I watched the live security feed on my laptop screen, silently witnessing the ultimate devastating conclusion to his pathetic reign of terror. The officers frog marched Jared right down the center of the long, winding driveway. Outside the towering wrought iron gates, the 22 extended relatives stood packed tightly on the public sidewalk. Their scrambling had ceased entirely. They watched in stunned, horrifying silence as the undisputed golden child of the family, the man who had promised them 2 weeks of unparalleled luxury and immense wealth, was paraded directly in front of them in iron shackles. No one spoke. No one rushed to his defense. They simply parted like the Red Sea as the officer shoved his struggling, weeping body deep into the cramped back seat of a marked police cruiser, like a common, thoroughly disgraced criminal permanently sealing his fate. The flashing emergency lights faded into the distance, taking the chaotic noise of the arrest with them. Inside my empty mansion, the silence rushed back in heavy and suffocating. Catherine and Brittany remained pressed against the bare drywall of the grand living room. They were completely paralyzed, their eyes wide with shock as the reality of Jared's incarceration settled over them. The invincible provider they had relied on to fund their extravagant delusions was gone. They had no access to his stolen wealth, no luxurious event venue, and absolutely zero leverage left to exploit. I sat on my motorized medical bed, adjusting the dark emerald silk of my lounger over my rigid spinal brace. I looked at the two women who had spent years treating me with relentless, suffocating disdain. They expected me to offer some form of consolation, or perhaps engage in a screaming match to validate their victimhood. I did neither. I maintained a cold, detached silence and turned my attention to the towering security team lead standing near the foyer. I caught his eye and delivered a single definitive nod. Silas instantly understood the command. He signaled the remaining tactical guards. Moving with swift, intimidating precision, the security detail stepped forward, closing the distance between themselves and my stunned in-laws. Silas coldly informed them that their authorization to be on the premises had been officially revoked, and it was time for them to leave immediately. The sudden, forceful reality of their eviction broke their stunned paralysis. Catherine erupted into a shrill, hysterical fit of sobbing. She aggressively planted her expensive heels against the exposed hardwood floor, screaming that she was the mother of the groom and demanded the right to stay. Brittany began wailing wildly, stomping her feet and demanding the guards fetch her massive designer luggage from the driveway. She shrieked that she absolutely refused to step foot outside without her expensive makeup kits and custom wardrobe. The security veterans remained entirely unfazed by their theatrical tantrums. They did not utter a single word of negotiation or sympathy. They simply closed in, using their broad shoulders and sheer physical presence to forcefully herd the two weeping women out of the grand living room. Catherine tried to dig her manicured fingernails into the doorframe, sobbing about her fragile nerves. A guard effortlessly detached her grip, marching her swiftly through the grand foyer. Brittany shrieked as a guard pointed her directly toward the exit, her influencer persona completely disintegrating into an undignified, chaotic mess. They were marched out the heavy double doors, their designer sandals slipping clumsily on the front stone steps as they were physically removed from the property they had so desperately tried to steal. From my laptop screen, I watched the high-definition security feed capture their humiliating march down the long, winding driveway. The guards did not let up the pace, trailing closely behind them to ensure they did not stop or attempt to turn back. When they reached the perimeter, Silas remotely triggered the wrought iron gates. The heavy metal bars parted just enough to thrust Catherine and Brittany out onto the public sidewalk. The moment their feet hit the pavement, the gates aggressively slammed shut, the electronic deadbolts engaging with a loud final crack. Outside the barricade, the scene was a volatile powder keg of raw panic and boiling anger. The 22 extended relatives were still swarming the sidewalk, their previous excitement for a free luxury vacation entirely replaced by the terrifying realization that they had been dragged into the epicenter of a massive federal crime. They were stranded in a wealthy suburb with no hotel reservations, no local transportation, and a fleet of rental SUVs secured by credit cards that were undoubtedly frozen by federal investigators. Catherine, desperate to regain a shred of her shattered matriarchal authority, wiped her mascara-stained cheeks and puffed up her chest. She turned to her older brother, pointing an imperious finger, and aggressively commanded him to clear out the back seat of his rental vehicle for her and Brittany. She ordered her cousins to immediately locate a 5-star hotel downtown and book a penthouse suite on their own dime to compensate for this horrific inconvenience. The response from her family was absolute, unforgiving silence. The aunts and uncles who had eagerly listened to her brag about her son's limitless wealth for years now looked at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. They had heard the audio broadcast over the security speakers. They knew Catherine had actively plotted to drug an injured woman and steal a multi-million-dollar estate. The toxic loyalty that usually bound them together dissolved instantly in the face of criminal liability. Her brother stepped forward, his face dark with fury. He bluntly told Catherine that she and her felon son had humiliated their entire bloodline. He explicitly stated that no one in the crowd was going to offer her a ride, and absolutely no one was going to spot her a single cent for a hotel room. The extended relatives turned their backs on her in unison. They huddled together, frantically dialing local taxi companies and desperately trying to figure out how to escape the suburban street. Catherine and Brittany were completely shunned, exiled by the very people they had tried to impress. As the chaotic crowd milled around the sidewalk, a vehicle approached from down the street. It was not a sleek black car or a luxury sport utility vehicle. It was a modest, slightly weathered, highly reliable pickup truck. The truck rolled smoothly up to the curb, parking just behind the blockade of panicked relatives. The doors opened, and Andre stepped out, his heavy canvas work jacket zipped against the crisp air. From the passenger side emerged Monica Jared's older sister. They looked completely unfazed by the extravagant designer luggage littering the pavement or the hysterical weeping of the women on the curb. They radiated an aura of quiet, grounded decency. Catherine's eyes lit up with desperate relief the second she spotted her eldest daughter. She completely ignored the years of blatant disrespect she had aimed at Monica and Andre. She rushed forward, grabbing Monica's arm with trembling hands. She wailed about the horrific injustice she had suffered, demanding that Monica open the doors of the pickup truck and drive her and Brittany back to their house immediately to escape the nightmare. Andre smoothly stepped between his wife and his frantic mother-in-law. He did not raise his voice. He did not offer a lecture or an insult. He simply looked at Catherine with calm, impenetrable indifference and gently removed her clutching hands from Monica's coat. Andre turned his back on the hysterical matriarch entirely. Instead, he and Monica focused their attention on the bewildered elderly aunts and uncles shivering near the iron gates. Andre warmly offered the innocent, older relatives a safe ride to a comfortable, moderately priced hotel downtown, assuring them they would handle the immediate logistics. The elderly relatives accepted with profound gratitude. Andre and Monica carefully helped them load their modest bags into the spacious cab of the pickup truck, ensuring they were warm and secure. Andre shut the heavy truck door with a solid thud. He walked around to the driver's side, climbed behind the wheel, and started the engine. He pulled away from the curb, merging smoothly into the street traffic without casting a single backward glance. Catherine and Brittany were left standing completely alone on the cold concrete sidewalk, weeping uncontrollably next to their towering, utterly useless designer suitcases. 6 months passed, sweeping away the toxic wreckage of my former marriage with the cold precision of a winter storm giving way to spring. I walked across the gleaming hardwood floors of my grand living room, my strides long, confident, and completely pain-free. The heavy, rigid lumbar brace that had once encased my torso was finally gone, discarded months ago as my fused spine healed perfectly. My physical therapy had been intense, but I conquered every milestone with the exact same ruthless determination I applied to my corporate audits. The physical recovery mirrored the absolute reclamation of my entire life. My 10,000 square foot estate was no longer a hollow echoing cavern, nor was it the ostentatious performative showroom Jared had constantly tried to curate. I had meticulously refurnished every single room, tailoring the entire aesthetic exclusively to my own personal taste. Rich, deep jewel tones replaced the sterile white walls. Custom artwork that I genuinely loved hung in the grand foyer, and the massive sunlight-filled spaces were anchored by warm, elegant, modern fixtures. There was not a single lingering trace of my ex-husband left within these walls. The very air in the mansion felt entirely different. It was light, peaceful, and beautifully quiet. The oppressive, suffocating weight of his constant demands and his family's relentless entitlement had been permanently eradicated from my sanctuary. The swift and absolute brutality of the federal justice system had handled the rest of the garbage disposal. Jared's spectacular downfall was a masterclass in arrogant hubris meeting immovable reality. Faced with the impenetrable mountain of forensic evidence I had delivered directly to the authorities, his expensive defense attorneys quickly realized a trial would be a public slaughter. Jared took a plea deal to avoid the maximum penalty, but the presiding judge showed absolutely zero leniency for his calculated corporate theft. My former husband was currently wearing a standard-issue uniform, serving a very lengthy sentence in a federal penitentiary for grand larceny and wire fraud. He had traded his tailored designer suits for a bleak concrete cell. His lucrative career in the technology sector was permanently vaporized. The collateral damage to his mother and sister was equally devastating and deserved. Catherine and Brittany were completely bankrupted. Federal investigators aggressively seized every asset linked to the embezzled funds to pay back the stolen corporate money. Brittany's luxury sports car was impounded. Her offshore accounts were frozen, and her highly anticipated lifestyle brand collapsed before it even officially launched. She became a massive laughingstock on social media, her influencer persona permanently destroyed by the undeniable taint of federal crime. Catherine faced an even harsher, more personal purgatory. The local country club revoked her elite membership immediately. Her wealthy suburban social circle, the very people she had desperately tried to impress for decades, completely shunned her. She became a total pariah, forced to downsize to a cramped, modest apartment across town, entirely isolated and left to wallow in the bitter reality of her own criminal complicity. With the toxic debris of the past firmly swept away, I focused my considerable resources on building a future rooted in genuine loyalty. I grabbed my keys from the pristine marble kitchen counter, walked out the heavy front doors, and slid into the driver's seat of my car. I navigated the winding suburban roads, heading directly into the bustling heart of the city's expanding commercial district. The morning traffic moved swiftly, mirroring my bright, optimistic mood as I approached my destination with a deep, calm sense of profound anticipation. I pulled up to a newly renovated, highly impressive commercial property situated on a prime corner lot. The exterior was sleek and radiated professional success. A massive, beautifully designed sign hung above the wide entrance, proudly advertising a high-end residential contracting and custom design firm. The expansive parking lot was absolutely packed with heavy supplier trucks and premium client vehicles, a clear, undeniable testament to a booming, highly sought-after business operating at maximum capacity. I stepped out of my car, smoothly adjusting the crisp lines of my tailored blazer, and walked purposefully toward the grand entrance, feeling an overwhelming quiet sense of profound satisfaction. As I pushed through the heavy, gleaming glass doors, the bustling noise of a thriving office washed over me. Phones were ringing steadily, seasoned architects were reviewing complex blueprints at large drafting tables, and the energy in the expansive room was incredibly vibrant. I did not even make it 5 steps into the welcoming reception area before my presence was spotted. A joyous, booming voice called out my name over the ambient office chatter. I turned just in time to be enveloped in a massive, genuinely warm hug. It was Andre. He wore a crisp, branded polo shirt, his dark eyes radiating absolute joy and profound gratitude. A second later, Monica rushed out from a glass-walled corner office, her face lighting up with a brilliant, unburdened smile as she quickly joined the tight embrace. They were the undisputed proud owners of this spectacular, rapidly expanding commercial enterprise. They had worked tirelessly for years to build their contracting business from the ground up, always operating with strict, unwavering integrity, while being constantly belittled by Catherine and Jared for not chasing shallow, flashy wealth. They proved that genuine talent and hard work always outshine manipulative greed. What Andre and Monica did not know, and what I was finally here to reveal, was the true origin of the massive, anonymous venture capital grant that had recently allowed them to purchase this prime commercial real estate and quadruple their operational capacity. I had secretly structured and provided the massive seed funding through a blinded proxy as a silent thank you for their unwavering loyalty and integrity during my darkest hour. It was finally time to share the brilliant, undeniable truth. Seeing their business flourish validated every single ruthless calculation I had made to tear down the deceptive parasites and build up the people who truly mattered. The shock and overwhelming joy radiating from Andre and Monica inside their bustling commercial headquarters eventually settled into a profound shared warmth. We left the busy office and drove to a fantastic, highly exclusive restaurant located in the heart of the city. I had secured a private corner booth weeks in advance, insulated from the loud chatter of the main dining room. The ambiance was impeccably curated, featuring soft lighting and the soothing notes of a live jazz pianist. It was the exact opposite of the chaotic, suffocating family dinners Catherine used to orchestrate. There were no petty interrogations about my career, no passive-aggressive remarks regarding my wardrobe, and absolutely no performative displays of fake wealth. We simply sat together around a beautifully set table, reviewing the incredible progress they had made since I quietly provided the anonymous venture capital. Andre poured a glass of sparkling water for his wife before turning his bright, enthusiastic gaze toward me. He excitedly detailed the commercial contracting projects his team was currently bidding on, his deep voice carrying genuine, hard-earned pride. Monica leaned against his shoulder, her eyes sparkling as she outlined the architectural design division she was single-handedly expanding. They operated as a flawless, synchronized team. I listened intently, offering strategic financial advice when asked, but mostly just basking in the sheer joy of watching good people finally achieve the massive success they inherently deserved. We shared appetizers and laughed openly, the sound echoing freely in our private booth. It was an incredibly refreshing, entirely foreign experience. The heavy, toxic hierarchy that had rigorously defined my interactions with my former in-laws was completely absent. We were simply 3 equal professionals, celebrating a bright, highly lucrative future. As the waiter cleared our main courses, the easy banter slowly shifted into more serious, reflective territory. Monica reached across the crisp white tablecloth and gently placed her hand over mine. I could see the raw, unfiltered emotion swimming in her dark eyes. Her voice trembled slightly as she formally thanked me for the financial investment that had revolutionized their entire business. She insisted they would spend the next decade paying me back every single cent with interest. Her gratitude quickly morphed into a deep, lingering sorrow. Tears spilled over her lashes as she profoundly apologized for the absolute nightmare her mother and brother had put me through. She confessed that the guilt of sharing their bloodline occasionally kept her awake at night, horrified by the extreme predatory malice her own family had actively orchestrated while my spine was literally healing. I turned my hand over, firmly squeezing her fingers. I looked directly into her tear-filled eyes and immediately stopped her from carrying another ounce of that unearned guilt. I spoke with absolute, unwavering certainty. I reminded her that shared DNA does not mandate loyalty, nor does it excuse blatant criminality. I told her that she and Andre were the only ones who showed up at my front door with hot food and a critical warning when the rest of her family was plotting my total financial ruin. They had prioritized my safety over their toxic familial obedience. I explicitly assured Monica that she and her husband were the only true family I ever needed from that bloodline. Their profound integrity had permanently secured my loyalty. My financial investment in their firm was not a loan to be repaid, it was a deeply earned reward for their phenomenal character. Sitting in the warm glow of the restaurant, I allowed myself a moment of deep, silent reflection regarding the entire brutal ordeal. The past 6 months had been a staggering crucible of pain, betrayal, and ultimate vindication. I realized with absolute clarity that establishing firm boundaries is never an act of cruelty. It is an act of profound self-respect. Jared had fundamentally mistaken my temporary physical vulnerability for permanent weakness. My high-risk spinal surgery had temporarily incapacitated my body, but discovering his grotesque betrayal had forcefully ignited my mind. The extortion plot had not broken me. Instead, it had methodically stripped away my remaining illusions and forged an impenetrable, unbreakable mental armor. I had learned how to weaponize my own intellect, turning their arrogant, predictable greed into the exact instrument of their spectacular downfall. I was no longer a victim. I was the architect of my own absolute peace. The waiter returned to our table, discreetly placing the leather-bound check presenter on the edge of the polished wood. Andre immediately stopped talking mid-sentence and instinctively reached across the table, fully intending to cover the expensive celebratory dinner. He playfully insisted it was the very least he could do for their silent investor. I laughed, a genuine bright sound that felt good in my chest, and swiftly snatched the leather folder right out of his grasp. I tapped my heavy black card against the tray with a definitive sharp click, smoothly handing it back to the waiting server before Andre could mount a proper protest. I reminded him that I was the forensic auditor, which meant I always controlled the final ledger. Andre shook his head, chuckling warmly in absolute defeat, while Monica beamed at my stubborn independence. The server returned my card. I tucked it safely away and reached for my glass of vintage red wine. Andre and Monica immediately raised their glasses to meet mine. The crystal chimed with a clear, beautiful ringing note. I looked at the two magnificent, loyal people sitting across from me and offered a final triumphant toast. We drank to new beginnings, the undeniable power of chosen family, and the brilliant, unwavering truth. As the rich wine warmed my throat, my thoughts drifted back to my sprawling 10,000-square-foot estate waiting for me in the quiet suburbs. I smiled, savoring the absolute perfect reality of my victory. I was going home to the beautiful, flawless silence of an empty, highly secured mansion that was finally completely and undeniably my own.